I never thought a simple rose could cause such a stir in my heart. It was as if, for a moment, the world stopped just so I could see it. Red, alive, its petals perfectly open as if smiling at me. It was there, alone, resting on my Bible, as if God had left a different kind of message that day. My first instinct was to look around, expecting someone to claim responsibility for the unusual gesture, but the church was empty. No cards, no signatures, no explanations, just the flower lying among the scriptures, like a silent provocation to my impeccable routine. I stood there, hands trembling, feeling a warmth rise to my cheeks, something between fear and enchantment. That rose wasn't just beautiful, it was wrong. Wrong for me, for who I was, for what was expected of me, and yet I took it. When I hid it in my bag, like concealing a secret, something inside me shifted. I didn't know who had left that flower, but somehow I already knew it wasn't someone approved by the world around me. And maybe that was exactly why it was so impossible to forget. The days that followed were spent pretending normalcy, fulfilling my duties with the same polite smile as always, attending services, organizing church events, responding to every "God bless you, Eloise" with the kindness I'd been taught since childhood. But inside, there was another. Eloise. One who revisited that rose in thought like someone revisiting a forbidden dream. I began to observe more, to listen more, to notice faces that had once been invisible to me. It was during one of these observations that I saw him. Jasper Hale, leaning against the rusty iron gate of the church's abandoned garden, a forgotten cigarette between his fingers, and a gaze that didn't apologize for existing. He didn't seem to belong to that world, and maybe that's what drew me to him so much. I vaguely remembered him from when we were children, before the town decided he was a mistake not to be repeated. Now he was there, grown, marked, and staring at me. Not invasively. It was as if he knew, as if he was certain I had found the rose. And in that moment, though I didn't understand how I knew, it was his. That flower was his way of entering my world. And the worst part? It worked. Because from then on, no matter how much I prayed, I couldn't get him out of my mind. It didn't take long for the silence between us to begin to unravel. Not through words, not at first, but through glances that lingered a second too long, through orchestrated encounters along the garden paths, through simple gestures carrying complex intentions. Jasper never directly said he was the one who left the rose, but he never tried to deny it either. There was a dangerous calmness in his way of being, as if he didn't care about the consequences, as if the world had already judged him and he'd accepted the verdict, but chosen to live anyway, and that somehow disarmed me. I, who was raised to follow rules, to never raise my voice, to be an example. I began to feel that by his side, I didn't need to pretend I didn't feel. And that was what scared me most. How easily that misfit presence made everything that once seemed right start to feel suffocating. I remember the first time our fingers touched. It was by accident, while I was helping arrange the flower pots in the church garden. Something he started showing up for too, under the excuse of community volunteering, though everyone knew no one had invited him. Our fingers brushed for a second, but the shock was real. It wasn't a spark or something worthy of cheap poetry. It was subtler, more human. It was as if in that moment I had touched something that had always been missing in me, something I'd never known how to name. After that, avoiding him became an exercise in strength I didn't possess. Every hidden meeting, every short conversation, every unspoken word fueled a restlessness that even the most comforting psalms couldn't silence. I began to run from myself, to look at my reflection with guilt, but also with curiosity. I was changing, and it wasn't just because of him. It was as if the rose had planted something in me that had existed long before Jasper appeared. He just had the courage to nurture it. My faith began to waver. Not because I stopped believing in God, but because I started doubting the voices that claimed to speak for him. Everything around me pushed me away from that feeling, as if loving was a sin, as if desiring someone like Jasper would open the gates of hell. But when we were together, even for brief, stolen moments, I felt it peace, a different peace from the one I found in hymns and prayers, more alive, more urgent, more real. That's when I realized my life was heading toward the point of no return. I could still stop. I could still say no. But deep down, a part of me had already chosen, and even without admitting it out loud, I knew I was willing to pay the price. The night everything broke started like any other. My father preached with his usual fervor. The congregation murmured their amens, and I, sitting in the front pew, pretended to listen while my mind wandered far away, specifically to the old stone wall behind the church, where Jasper often waited for me when the world wasn't watching. I felt split into two versions: the pastor's daughter, a model of righteousness, and the young woman who, in secret, was discovering the bitter and sweet taste of freedom. I knew I was walking a tightrope, but it was as if the thrill of falling was part of the allure. And that night, unaware it was the last time everything was still intact, I allowed myself to embrace the risk more fully than I should have. I met him after the service, as we'd planned through notes we exchanged like teenagers, trying to outwit a watchful world. He was standing, leaning against the wall, holding a new rose between his fingers. He didn't say anything. He just extended the flower as before, and I took it in silence. It was the touch of his hand that exposed me. Someone saw us, and not just anyone. One of the church deacons, known for his zeal, his sharp tongue, and his devotion to policing others' purity. I didn't notice right away. I only felt hours later the weight of my father's gaze when I walked into the house. It wasn't anger, it was something worse. Disappointment wrapped in judgment. The kind of silence that speaks louder than a sermon. I was called to talk the next morning. It wasn't really a conversation, it was a tribunal. They told me I was confused, that I was being manipulated, that Jasper was a danger, a threat, a mistake. They quoted verses, reminded me of the promises I'd made to God, of our family's honor, of the church's reputation. I stayed quiet for a while, fighting back tears, wishing it was all a misunderstanding. But deep down I knew the secret was out. The rose, which I still kept hidden inside a book, now burned as evidence of an unforgivable rebellion. They asked me to renounce, to forget, to erase. In that moment, I felt everything I had been until then being torn away from me, not by choice, but by demand. And even with my heart breaking, I couldn't promise obedience. For the first time, I didn't say, "Yes, sir." For the first time, I looked into my father's eyes and stayed silent. Not because I had no answer, but because the answer pulsing within me was unacceptable to him. In that silence, I realized I was alone, and yet more alive than ever. The house grew colder after that day, not because of the weather, but because of the kind of silence that fills spaces when words have already wounded too deeply. My father stopped looking me in the eyes. My mother began to move as if afraid to touch me. And the congregation looked at me as if I had caught a disease that might spread if I wasn't isolated in time. I saw myself reduced to a shadow in the home where I had once been light. But strangely, even with the weight of judgment hovering over me, there was a fire in my chest that none of this coldness could extinguish. I knew what I had felt, and I knew it wasn't sin, it was love, or something dangerously close to it. Jasper didn't run. On the contrary, he returned to the church garden as if defying every watching eye, as if saying without words that he had nothing to hide. I watched him from a distance, lacking the courage to approach in the first few days. But the pain of distance was crueler than any punishment. And when I finally crossed the rusty gate and saw him turn slowly at the sound of my footsteps, I knew there was no turning back. He didn't ask questions. He just listened. I told him everything, every word my parents said, every twisted verse, every veiled threat. Jasper listened with that raw calm only he had, and when I finished, all he did was extend his hand. I took it. And in that moment I understood that love, to be true, doesn't need approval. It only needs courage. We began meeting more often, but with more caution. The places had to change, words were whispered instead of spoken freely, and gestures became silent codes. But the feeling, that grew. Jasper showed me the world outside the bubble I'd been raised in. He spoke of authors I'd never read, music I'd never been allowed to hear, pains he'd carried since childhood, scars no one had cared to tend. Little by little, I shed not only my blind beliefs, but also the fears that had kept me captive. And for the first time, I began to see my reflection without the frame of the perfect daughter. I was becoming someone my old self would never have recognized, and strangely, that brought me peace. But that peace came at a cost. The pastor's daughter's strange behavior began to fuel whispers, sidelong glances, and silent meetings among the church elders. With every Sunday, the tension grew. My absence from one event or another was noticed, my change in expression questioned. I knew it couldn't stay hidden for long. Something was going to explode, and when it did, nothing would be left standing. It was during a Sunday of Holy Communion that everything began to crumble for good. I was still there, sitting in the same pew, wearing the same light-colored dress, hands resting in my lap as I had my whole life. On the outside, I was the image everyone expected of me. On the inside, I felt like a field in flames. Jasper wasn't there, of course. He'd never be welcome at that altar. But even absent, he filled every corner of my mind. In that service, as my father preached about purity and obedience, I finally understood that his words weren't for me anymore. They were against me. He was speaking to me without saying my name, and everyone there knew it. Every sentence was a polished knife, plunged slowly into the center of my chest, without haste, without compassion. After the service, I was called to the pastor's office again. This time, it wasn't just my parents, but two members of the church. Consul. They asked me directly, "Are you involved with Jasper Hale?" And I knew that was the moment to decide between continuing to pretend or finally breathing without guilt. The silence stretched so long that one of them repeated the question. I simply said, "Yes." The word came out softer than I expected. There was no outburst. There was something worse, dismay. As if I had confessed to an unthinkable crime, the eldest among them, holding a Bible, asked me to pray, right there, to ask for forgiveness. My mother wept silently. My father only said, there was still time to turn back, but I couldn't anymore. I had already crossed the point of no return. Not out of stubbornness, but out of truth. I refused to pray. The news spread like poison through the church pews. I was stripped of all my roles, barred from singing, forbidden from teaching, the children excluded from women's meetings. People averted their eyes when I passed. Some crossed the street. Others whispered, but all judged. I was no longer the pastor's daughter. I was the disobedient one, the fallen one, the sinner. Yet every night when I met Jasper, I felt I had made the right choice. He didn't promise an easy future. He didn't recite rehearsed words, but he was honest, and by his side, I felt whole. For the first time, I wasn't just what others expected me to be. I was who I wanted to be. But the town was too small for long-kept secrets. And I knew the next step would come with force. When a woman challenges the system trembles, but not before trying to crush her. And something was coming. I felt it in the air, in the way people looked at me, in the grave tone of my father's words from the pulpit. They wouldn't leave me in peace. Not until I renounced or disappeared. The storm didn't come like a lightning bolt. It came as a gathering of clouds that everyone saw forming but no one dared name. Until, on a stifling Friday night, it unleashed its full fury. My father was waiting for me in the living room with an open Bible and an envelope in his hand. I didn't need to ask what it was. His look was enough, firm, severe, but with something broken behind it. It was a letter of dismissal. A formalization of my removal from all church duties, written in cold legalistic words that carried the weight of a sentence. I had become a scandal, an obstacle to the pastoral ministry's reputation. And though it wasn't written, the message was clear. Either I ended things with Jasper, or I should leave not just the church but the house. I read each line without reacting, because it didn't hurt like before. The pain was now an old acquaintance. What remained was a kind of clarity born of loneliness, the clarity of knowing I would never be accepted back as I was before. And maybe I shouldn't be. That night, I left without saying where I was going. I walked to the place where Jasper usually waited for me, and he was there, as if he knew. His eyes found me in the dark like silent beacons, and as I approached, I didn't need to say a word. He saw in me what no one else did, not the pastor's rebellious daughter, but the woman who had finally awakened. I sat beside him, and we stayed silent for a long time until I said, in a faint voice, "They gave me a choice." He didn't ask what it was. He just offered shelter with his gaze. That early morning I didn't go back home. For the first time, I didn't ask for permission. And though each step took me further from the roots of my entire life, it was as if, finally, my feet were touching solid ground. The days that followed were harsh. There was no comfort. There was no security. There was only the raw reality of the choice I'd made. But there was also freedom. And even with a wounded heart, I felt I could breathe. We moved into the back of Jasper's grandmother's old house, empty since her death. It was a small place, without luxury, but it carried the peace of not having to hide who we were. We learned to share silences, to build a routine without haste, to deal with the stares that still followed us through the streets. And there, among the simple walls and the garden he tended himself, the forbidden rose bloomed again, not just in the flower beds, but within me. The war wasn't over yet. What would come next, I didn't know. But one thing was certain. I would no longer be shaped by guilt. I would no longer live in fear of others' judgment. The choice had been made. And despite everything, even amidst rejection, abandonment, and emotional exile, I felt alive. Because love, when it's true, doesn't need to be shouted. It only needs to endure. And there, among the ashes of who I was and the seeds of who I could be, it was enduring. The days passed more slowly after I left, as if time had suddenly begun to respect my pace. Waking up without the church's obligations, without the constant expectation of perfection, was at first disorienting. For years, my identity had been built around what was expected of me. And now, without that daily mirror of demands, I had to face myself. The reflection was new, fragile, sometimes confusing, but honest. For the first time, I could make mistakes without the weight of a sermon. I could laugh without fear of reprimand. I could love without asking forgiveness for it. Jasper, with all his exposed imperfections, was my shelter. Not the kind that shields you from the world, but the kind that lets you rebuild yourself at your own pace. In the small gestures of everyday life, I found more comfort than in years of prayers. In his eyes, I saw acceptance, not as a reward but as a right, and that, for someone who had lived for others' approval, was revolutionary. But not everything was peace. The town talked. The names they gave me changed with the gossips' moods. Sometimes I was the lost girl. Sometimes the depraved one. Sometimes the daughter who shamed the pastor. Every time I went out to buy bread, I felt eyes following me. I smiled, even when it hurt, because that smile was my form of resistance. My father didn't reach out. Not a letter, not a visit, not a message. His absence, silent and cruel, was sharper than any verbal reproach. Sometimes I dreamed of him, dreamed of the moment he'd cross the street, look into my eyes and say, he still loved me, even if he didn't understand my choices. But upon waking, there was only silence, and I learned to live with it. Then something in me began to change again. Not with the shock of the unexpected, but with the steadiness of someone who had hit rock bottom and learned to swim. I started writing. Nothing grand, just scattered pieces of thoughts I could never say aloud. Words that would once have been sin were now healing. I wrote about love, faith, guilt, freedom. Jasper read everything with the care of someone touching something sacred. And slowly I realized my voice no longer needed a pulpit. It could echo in other ways. Quieter perhaps, more intimate, but no less true. Then one morning, as I opened the window, I saw something unexpected. My father, standing across the street, holding an envelope. He didn't cross. He didn't wave. He just stood there for a few seconds before leaving the envelope on the step and walking away. Inside was a letter. Short, harsh, but with something that made me cry for hours. The rose wasn't the sin. It was the mirror. That was all. Nothing more. No signature. But I knew. And in that moment I understood that though forgiveness doesn't always come with open arms, it can come with the courage to look at oneself. And for my father, that was already an immense step. The letter stayed on the table for days. Not because I hadn't read it. I read it so many times I knew it by heart. But because I couldn't bring myself to put it away. It represented something deeper than any apology. A crack, however small, in the wall of certainties my father had always built. That phrase, the rose wasn't the sin, it was the mirror, echoed in me like a belated liberation, a truth he had never dared admit aloud. And even without embraces, without tears, without public reconciliation, there was something there that gave me a different kind of peace. I might never be the daughter he idealized again, but perhaps he had finally understood that I never needed to be. Life with Jasper settled into a mature silence. It was no longer the urgent passion that pushed us toward each other as if we were about to collapse. It was calmer, more present, more intentional. We began tending the garden at the house, the same one where the roses, stubborn, insisted on blooming, as if they knew more than flowers had grown there. We had little, but we had everything that mattered. He spoke less and less about running away, and I less and less about going back. It was as if the past had stopped nipping at our heels. We began to look forward, even without knowing what lay ahead. It wasn't long before a small reading circle formed on our porch. Nothing religious, nothing militant, just a group of women thirsty for words that weren't guilt. At first there were 3 of us, then 5. Within months, more than a dozen. Each brought a book, a pain, a hope. There, amid shy laughter and emotional confessions, I felt I had rediscovered my faith, not in institutions, but in people. In listening, in welcoming. in love that doesn't need rules to be sacred. On the last Friday of September, the garden was especially vibrant. The red roses, the ones that always seemed to have a soul of their own, bloomed as if they knew something was about to happen. I watched them for a few minutes, trying to understand why that day felt so different. There was no noise in the air, no new news, no unexpected letter at the door. But there was a deep calm within me, the kind you only feel when your soul, after so much struggle, finally finds a place to rest. Jasper appeared behind me with 2 cups of tea and a quiet smile, as if he felt the same meaningful silence. We didn't need to talk, just to be. That's when I heard the sound of light footsteps at the gate. I thought it might be a neighbor, perhaps another woman wanting to join the reading circle. But when I looked, I saw my father, alone, dressed, simply hands empty, his face aged, his eyes different. There was no judgment, no accusation, just an old weariness and a sadness I knew well. The sadness of someone who had finally accepted they'd lost something precious. For a moment I didn't know if I should stand and go to him or wait. But he took the initiative. He entered slowly, without ceremony, as if he knew he no longer had authority there, only memories. When he stopped in front of me, he took a few seconds before saying anything. And when he spoke, it wasn't with the pastor's voice. It was with the father's. I came to see the roses. That disarmed me. I didn't cry. I didn't run to hug him. But I pulled up a chair, and he sat. Jasper, respectfully, stepped away, and there, amid the scent of the flowers that had united and divided us, my father and I sat in silence. A silence that this time didn't cut, it healed. He told me, with long pauses, that he too had loved once and given up, out of fear, for faith, for others, and that perhaps I had been stronger than he ever had the courage to be. He didn't apologize, but he didn't try to justify either, and that, somehow, was the truest gesture he could give me. When he left behind a rose, not red, but white, a fragile piece, perhaps, but real. I understood then that some stories don't need perfect endings. They just need truths spoken, bonds rebuilt without haste, new paths opened with one's own feet. Today, as I walk among the rose bushes I planted with Jasper, as I listen to the voices of women finding themselves in their own stories, as I see my reflection without guilt, I know that rose, the first, the forbidden one, wasn't the start of a mistake. It was the birth of my freedom. And no matter how many thorns wounded me along the way, I bloomed. Whole, true to myself. Time passed, and with it, the wounds closed. Not all, but enough for life to continue with lightness. The church went on, my father too. We're still different in every way, but today we look at each other without weapons in hand. He visits the garden from time to time. He doesn't say much, but he always stops by the roses and breathes deeply, as if understanding what he once condemned. Jasper remains my foundation. We still laugh at the same things, still tend the flowers, still find meaning in the small details that keep us alive. The women keep coming, each with her story, her pain, her courage. The house has become more than a home. It's a refuge. And I, who was once just the pastor's daughter, am now many things: woman, partner, learner, scar, and root. Because every rose, even the most forbidden, needs solid ground to bloom. And I found mine.